Wisconsin Eye's 2014 election coverage is brought to you by the Wisconsin Hospital Association. For over 90 years, a valued voice for Wisconsin hospitals, supporting high-quality, high-value care in communities like yours.
Wisconsin Eye coverage of the 2014 elections continues. We're interviewing Mr. Peter Theron of Madison. He's the Republican candidate in the 2nd Congressional District. Peter, welcome back to Wisconsin Eye.
It's good to be back.
And a programming note, Wisconsin Eye appreciates the support of the Wisconsin Hospital Association, which represents more than 139 hospitals and health systems, for making these candidate interviews possible. Peter, I'm intrigued by your campaign slogan, which I hear on the radio. Change your congressman, which I understand because you're running against incumbent Democrat Mark Pocan. Keep your doctor, renew America. Can we start with why you chose Keep Your Doctor and Renew America, please?
Certainly. Let's first of all renew America. If we think back, this year is the 45th anniversary of the moon landing. And I don't know, I suspect that for you it was the same as for me. My father got me up and
it's very exciting.
Very late at night, and I get to watch it on a little black and white TV. So I grew up learning how to count down by watching Apollo liftoffs.
10, 9, 8, excuse me.
That's it, 10, 9, 8. Whereas nowadays, this generation's grown up learning how to count down watching microwave. And so, you know, the dreams are much smaller. And then we think back 6 years ago, gas was $1.79 a gallon. If we think back to '69, gas was 30 cents a gallon. Mm-hmm. And so we're, you know, inflation is not something that's a normal thing. If you go back in history from 1789 up to 1914, a dollar's worth of goods in 1789 would have been worth approximately $1.04 in 1914. So almost no inflation over 100 years. Right. Whereas going forward, we've had a much different inflation story. So this notion of inflation is very modern. Again, constricting our dreams. And then you look at foreign affairs. 6 years ago, Iraq was stable and Crimea was part of Ukraine. Now Iraq's in flames and Crimea is part of Russia. Also 6 years ago we had 10 trillion in debt, too much, but the world wanted our dollars. Now we're $17 trillion in debt, and there's talk of China selling our bonds. So there's just the sense that things are not right domestically, things are not right overseas.
You'd be one of 435 members of Congress.
But again, to solve the problem, you've got to admit the problem, and so saying, okay, we agree, we realize that things are not right, and now, well, what are some things that we had 6 years ago that, 6 years ago, if you liked your plan, you could keep your plan. Okay. If you liked your doctor, you could keep your doctor.
Now you're on your keep your doctor theme.
So keep the doctor. So there, 6 years ago, we had the best healthcare system in the world. And in any dispute, just think about people were coming to the U.S. to be cured for medical procedures. Right. That's not as much the case now, and now we have medical tourism going out. So, our healthcare system was the best in the world. Whether it still is up to, open to question.
A follow-up question just on that subject. What do you think has been the impact of the Affordable Care Act on Wisconsin? You're kind of talking about the nation, but what?
Oh, I know that in Wisconsin it certainly had an effect on premiums. It certainly has had an effect on jobs. And, for example, when Target announced that they were cutting their part-time employee health care. Mm-hmm. They had a system which was good for Target as well as for their part-timers, that if a part-timer worked a certain number of hours in a year, then they offered that part-timer health insurance.
Yes.
And so what that allowed was they could have the part-timers who would be their extra staff at Christmas time, working lots of hours and then not working so much the rest of the year, but they'd still get health insurance, and so they would have a more stable and experienced sales staff or just general staff to be able to ramp up in their busy times and then reduce their employment when they were less busy. So that went away because of the so-called Affordable Care Act. Also, the part-timers being, well, I should say full-timers being forced to part-time now being considered merely 30 hours per week, whereas it used, 39 was considered part-time, and you having then situations where stores are using scheduling programs where they essentially require their part-timers to commit to 40 or 60 hours, but then they'll only bring them in for 10 or 15. Well, you can't have two part-time jobs in that situation. So there's been definitely hurt.
So you'd go to Washington to repeal the Affordable Care Act?
Definitely.
What about the provisions that seem popular? No limit on care coverage and pre-existing conditions, and young adults can get coverage through age 26. Would you keep those? My question is, if your party repealed affordable care, what would replace it?
Well, I think first of all, we were promised a national conversation on health care, which we never got. So I think that's one thing we need to have a national conversation, because all of those things are good, but they're also need to be paid for. So there are trade-offs there, and we should be honest as to what they are. And I think that's a very important conversation to have.
Okay.
And so, yes, there are ways. One of the big problems we have in healthcare right now is that it's expensive. You don't see people worried about as much about, well, do you have collision insurance? Well, because for minor things, it happens, and you're able to pay for it. Whereas something that's minor in the health industry can often be thousands of dollars. And so if we start with things to build on the very successful experiments we've had, if you will, with, say, cosmetic surgery and LASIK eye surgery, where those are much more out of pocket, and hence people are concerned about how much they pay, they shop, and those prices have actually gone down. If we have more things that are where the consumer is paying, with say an HSA or the Medicare Advantage was very popular and was containing costs. So we had things that were working, and the Affordable Care Act gutted HSAs, reduced the funding on Medicare Advantage, and so it sort of took things that were working and threw them out. Okay. So bringing those back, and again, the big thing is we need to work towards getting the market more involved in health care, because then the cost of health care goes down, then the cost of health insurance will also go down.
Before I ask you about specific issues, including foreign policy, let me ask you this question. You want to go to Washington to join a party where Speaker Boehner has often had many disagreements with his Tea Party. How would you blend into this fascinating dialogue between House Republicans, Speaker Boehner, Tea Party, some moderates? Well, essentially, where would you fit in?
What I would want to do is to go to Washington to represent my constituents. This is a district which has a large number of state employees. And so I think that it's important to recognize that the federal government is hurting state employees, because the mandate comes down from the federal government, but it's a state employee that's got to implement it, has got to take the wrath of the public. Mm-hmm. and so if we get the federal government out of decisions and policy areas that are better handled at the state level, then the state employees, they're going to have the authority as well as the responsibility. Right now they've got the responsibility, but the authority is coming down from Washington, D.C.
If you're elected on November 4, what one benchmark would you like to be judged 2 years later as having had a successful first term or not so successful? One goal.
I think that what we really need to do is to look at our federal spending and say, right now, inflation is a federal phenomenon. Because we are overspending and have been overspending for decades, we have a very significant debt. We have inflation. If we're able to freeze federal spending, not cut it, just simply freeze it, then eventually revenues will quickly reach that level. We'll be able to run surpluses and hence tame inflation. So I think that inflation is really something that needs to be part of this conversation. And I would say that as far as a benchmark, bringing that to the fore and because pretty much, as you mentioned, is one of 435. What you have is a bully pulpit, the ability to raise issues, and that's something that I think I would bring.
Okay, now let's talk specific issues. You alluded earlier to foreign policy. Let's look around the world: Iraq, Syria, Israel, Palestine, Ukraine. When should America put, I'll use the term, boots, our soldiers on foreign soil?
Well, one thing I think that's important is that the Constitution says that the Congress declares war, but the executive is the commander-in-chief. You don't having 435 commanders-in-chief or wannabe commanders-in-chief is a recipe for disaster. But it is very important that the nation understands, okay, war is a serious thing. It will have financial consequences. It will have physical consequences. We are putting our soldiers in harm's way. At this point, there is still a resolution for the use of force in Iraq. Whether President Obama still has that authority, given he pulled all of our troops out of Iraq and declared that it was stable. If he's going to go back into Iraq, I think that he should ask for another resolution. If he's going to put boots on the ground elsewhere, I think he should also be asking, because essentially the executive is by design able to do things quickly, but again, quickly doesn't mean sustained. And to have a sustained presence, which frankly is something that we may need in certain places. For example, we went into Libya, we toppled Gaddafi, and today there's a story that the Islamic faction has now taken over the capital of Libya, Tripoli. And not to mention, I mean, they'd overrun Benghazi months ago. Was it appropriate for us to topple Gaddafi, given that what's followed is arguably worse? Should he have perhaps had more of a conversation before we went into that?
If President Obama asked Congress for a declaration of war against the terrorist group ISIS, and you're a member of the U.S. House, how would you vote?
Based on what I know now, I think that's a very appropriate thing. Okay. Again, as a member of Congress, I would then have access to more briefings, yes, to the classified briefings and so forth.
You would, yes.
So that might change my thoughts on that. But I think that right now we certainly, ISIS is very definitely a threat to the Middle East, and we've seen that the threats that seem to be far away in Afghanistan can suddenly appear in New York City. Okay. And given the condition of our border, and folks are already saying that members of ISIS are here in the United States, there is a sense that we have threats overseas that will not necessarily stay overseas.
Okay, let's talk about a domestic issue. Congress recently passed a short-term funding for highways and transportation programs, the pension smoothing. It's only going to work a few months, and everybody concedes that it's a stopgap solution. Long-term solution to paying for our highways and bridges, sir?
I think one thing we need to realize is the federal government is $17 trillion in debt. So long-term, the federal government cannot be the funder of all good things. A bridge is, for the most part, of benefit to a state. yeah, you'd have bridges between two states, but then, okay, it benefits those two states. I think more of that highway funding ought to be put back on the states. What I would suggest is perhaps the federal government might consider repealing the federal gasoline tax, which is where much of that highway funding comes.
Right.
And then that would give the states headroom to say, okay, if you want to use that money for your traffic, for your highway needs, transportation needs, you can raise your gas tax as we're lowering the federal tax.
Okay.
So that would be one, I think, a very reasonable way, because although highways are important for our nation, particularly the interstate system, I believe that too often the federal government says we're paying for it, so we're going to make the design decisions. And if we return the funding to the states, then the states make the design decisions, and they end up with a better product.
Another subject: Congress was unable to pass a compromise bill on immigration reform. If you're a member of Congress, what elements would you push for in that bill?
At this point, I think we have to insist that our borders are secure, and only after that happens does anything else even enter the room. Border security, number one, end of story at this point, because our southern border, not only is it not secure, in many places it doesn't even exist. And that's a serious problem. We don't know who's coming across. We don't know what diseases they're bringing. We don't know what else they're bringing. And so, first of all, we need to be secure in our borders.
If we got our borders secure, what about someone who's not been here legally for 15, 20 years? Should there be a ladder to citizenship for that person, sir?
What makes an American is following the law. And so we have people who are in their hearts Americans who are waiting overseas, having followed the law, to become legal immigrants. Those people have been waiting for 10 years as well. To say, okay, we're going to allow someone who didn't follow the law to cut in line is a slap in the face to those immigrants. The person who's been here for 10 years illegally, they know what the process is, and they've not followed it. I believe that that the folks who have followed the law, because they're trying to be Americans, as I said, because that's what an American does. An American follows the law. So those who follow the law have frankly become Americans to my eyes even before they reach our soil. Those who do not follow the law, even though they reach our soil, because they have not, it's very difficult to consider them Americans.
The 57,000 children, many of them from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, who crossed the border, do you think most, if not all of them, just need to be returned to their country of origin, sir?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Why?
Well, again, they and their parents were not following the law, Honduras is not a terrible place. Guatemala is not a terrible place. The children should be with their parents.
Okay. Two environmental questions. The Obama administration recently announced a carbon emission program that would let the state determine how it meets new carbon reduction goals. Do you support that?
No.
Why?
The administration's war on coal, a study was done, and it turns out that Wisconsin's 6th Congressional District, currently represented by Tom Petri, would be the hardest hit of all of the 435 congressional districts.
Number one.
Number one.
In damage done by that?
In damage done because of the percentage of electricity that district gets from coal-fired plants and the harm that would do the manufacturing there. So the coal-fired plants are currently a very important part of our electricity mix. We had the last cold winter, the analysis said that we came within one power plant failure of having the whole Northeast grid go down. If we start pulling off power plants now, I mean, January 1 is the date that many of these things are going to go into effect. They're forecasting that this winter could be again another hard winter. It's one thing to have your grid go down in July when it's just your air conditioning in the Northeast or in the Midwest. It's something entirely different if the grid goes down in January and it's your heat. So the war on coal is frankly misguided, and in terms of global warming, today's high is going to be 79, this winter, this summer has certainly for Wisconsin been one of the coolest we've had in quite some time.
On that subject, how pronounced is the threat to the world from global warming or climate change, sir?
I would say that it's not very. The first thing we have to realize is the climate has always been changing. We know that in the era of the dinosaurs it was much warmer, and then in the era of the ice ages it was much colder. Both of those were before carbon emissions of or man-made anything. So the climate has always fluctuated, and right now we're in a period that has typically been described as a global pause in heating. For 17 years, no appreciable warming in worldwide temperatures. To say that we have to do something now because, well, the data is saying the models are wrong. Well, if the models are wrong, then the predictions from the models are also wrong. Okay. One problem we've had that the global warming debate has highlighted is the politicization of science. Science is one of our greatest assets when it's allowed to tell the truth. But when the funding sources say, this is the kind of conclusion I want you to get, then what we get from science is not the truth, and we get misled. So if we're spending dollars and effort on averting something that turns out is not something which is inevitable or even imminent, then that's effort that's not spent on things like finding a cure for Ebola.
One more environmental question. Do you support the Keystone Pipeline?
Yes, I support the Keystone Pipeline.
Why?
Again, as I mentioned earlier, gas was $1.79 6 years ago. Now it's over $3.30. Okay. We need more supply, and that the Keystone Pipeline will increase that.
We've had an amazing set of disclosures by Edward Snowden about the practices of the National Security Administration or agency in the last year. Do you think that agency broke the law? Do you think they need to be reined in by some type of new law? Were you surprised by the disclosures?
In some sense, yes, and in some sense, no. In the sense that yes, because one always likes to think well of one's fellow man, and that the extent of government spying upon U.S. citizens was very distressing. Unfortunately, all bureaucracies, federal, state, local, private, public, eventually come to serve the administration of the bureaucracy, not their clientele. We saw this with the IRS. We've seen this with the EPA. We've seen this with the Veterans Administration, where they're essentially working for the desires of the administrator or the administration rather than for the public they're supposed to serve. That the NSA should fall prey to the same kind of bureaucratic drift is not surprising. I do think it's a problem because if you step back and think about the institutional pressures on the NSA, they desire to be able to read any communication anywhere. So in that sense, their desire is very similar to the desire of a Russian hacker who would also like to be able to read any communication anywhere. So the NSA then has become sort of institutionally aligned with someone who is not in our best interest. So yes, I think that the NSA needs to be rethought and probably broken up into smaller groups. But again, it all comes down to people and how they're held accountable.
Is there any doubt in your mind that the NSA data collection practices has kept America safer and prevented some potential terrorist acts?
Undoubtedly, it has. That's so. In some sense, they can't necessarily publicly make their case, and so I'm not saying I would abolish the NSA, because I believe that they do serve an important purpose. But I do think that there have been notable lapses. For example, the Boston Marathon bombing, where we were told, okay, these people are worrisome, and nothing happened. Mm-hmm. Now that wasn't necessarily the NSA falling down, but our whole government counterterrorism apparatus fell down at that point. And again, where was the accountability?
With all the emphasis on international turmoil, I want to bring us back to the fact that both Medicare and Social Security are on schedule to go broke. Mm-hmm. So I have to ask candidates for Congress, how would you fix them?
Well, first of all, folks, I appreciate that you're bringing up that question, because we have seen, as recently as 2 years ago, the demagogic ad of Paul Ryan pushing grandmother off the cliff. Well, that's essentially, if we do nothing, the numbers will do that. So Paul Ryan bringing up the fact that there is a problem, he took the arrows for being one of the first. Mm-hmm. Yes, now that we're, more folks are admitting that yes, Social Security and Medicare are not sustainable. Now we can start now that we've admitted there's a problem, we can start talking about solutions. So first of all is getting more people admitting, yes, these are unsustainable programs and we need to make changes. Then we need to again address the numbers. Medicare, as currently configured, is not only unsustainable, but because of healthcare cost inflation, it's unsupportable. We're going to need to address that again with the HSAs and with the Medicare Advantage, to getting the consumer into that market, and hence reining in the healthcare costs. With Social Security, Paul Ryan's initial proposal of, okay, it has to change for those who are younger, because it is unsustainable. The longer we wait, the definition of younger gets older and older. Mm-hmm. Now, we would endeavor to keep those who are currently on Social Security unchanged, and then those who are nearing retirement, again, unchanged. But for those who are farther away from retirement and have more chance to save, then we have to open that up and be very open in terms of, we're sorry, the actuarial numbers just do not allow us to continue this program, and we're going to have to give you a different option, probably in terms of an IRA, a Roth IRA, some kind of retirement plan that you control and are saving for your own retirement.
Okay. Two final questions. We're almost out of time. There's a cry. Some in Congress want a constitutional amendment to overturn the 2010 Citizens United ruling. How do you feel about that?
Well, one person, there's a saying from some time ago that if you want to get rid of corruption in high places, you get rid of high places. As long as our federal government has as many effects and as much control over our lives as it does, there will be people who are trying to either avoid that, either change what's happening or use that control to further their own interests, the cronyism problem. And they do that with money. The old statement of, was it Jesse Unruh, of money being the mother's milk of politics. If you try to say, okay, we will have no money in politics, well, what happens? Money is like water; it will find a way around. I mean, right now we're talking. We have super PACs. Why do we have super PACs? Because there are limits to how much you can give to an individual candidate. Well, if we relax those limits, but super PACs are unlimited. If we relax the limits, that people can give directly to a candidate, and the super PACs become unnecessary. But people felt, oh, let's tighten the limits to a candidate, and something else pops up. Okay. If you try to get rid of the super PACs, something else will pop up. Okay. Money is speech, and you will have people trying to influence both George Soros and Tom Steyer, as well as the Koch brothers, spending their money to influence politics.
My final question is, do you want to highlight some differences between you? You're running against incumbent Congressman, Democrat Mark Pocan. Differences between you and he?
I would say that Congressman Pocan represents the status quo. He represents the thinking that created the so-called Affordable Care Act behind closed doors, with lobbyists, but without Republican input. He's so very much the notion that if you think that Washington knows best, then that's his position. If you think that Washington doesn't know best, and we should instead be shrinking Washington and returning more of that authority to the state governments and local governments, well, then that's my position.
Very good. Peter Theron of Madison is the Republican candidate in the 2nd Congressional District. The election is November 4th. Peter, thank you so much for talking to Wisconsin Eye.
Quite welcome.
Thank you.